Hi, so today's lecture is about stereotypes and prejudice. And stereotypes is something that you'd all be very familiar with in your everyday life. You hold many stereotypes yourself, and you would have heard other people express stereotypes. We have some stereotypes that can be positive. So for example, you might have a stereotype that Asian people are particularly good at maths as opposed to people from different regions. There's also negative stereotypes, so you might hold a stereotype that women are bad drivers or that rich people tend to be arrogant. So there's many different stereotypes that we can have based on people's gender, their race, or other aspects such as their social standing. So today we're going to break down what are some of the origins, what are the causes of stereotypes, then how is it possible that stereotypes can lead to prejudice, and what's the difference between the two of them, and then how does this ultimately lead to discrimination. And that's kind of the important thing, is maybe you wouldn't be too concerned about stereotype and prejudice if it didn't lead to some behavioural outcome in the end where we are discriminating against other people. So within the social psychology literature, there's a pretty important distinction that gets made between what a stereotype is and what a prejudice is. So stereotyping generally refers to the sort of cognitive side of the process. So this is when we're thinking about a particular group, what are all the characteristics, the traits, the attributes that we would typically use to describe that group. So what is if you think of like the schema of a particular group, so think of your schema for Asian women, and that sort of schematic or the attributes that you would typically ascribe to them, that's your stereotype. Whereas in contrast, the prejudice relates to a much more kind of affective side. So it's the sort of emotional component of this, and particularly your evaluation of that outgroup. So whether it's a negative or a positive attitude that you hold towards them, and what emotional response does it evoke. So it can just be a kind of good, bad valence. We'll see a little bit later. There are particular outgroups, depending on their how you classify them, that can evoke specific emotional responses of whether that's being pity or envy, etc. So we'll see later that typically stereotyping is one of the precursors that can lead to prejudice, and then this experience of emotion is what leads on to discrimination. Okay, let's think of an example of this. So one illustration would be how somebody might hold negatively biased cognitions and prejudice against people who are overweight. So if we think of what is the stereotype, it would be classifying people that are overweight as being lazy. And this is something, this attribute you're ascribing to overweight people of their laziness, is something that might be driven by some sort of illusory correlation where you may experience seeing obese people that are portrayed in this way in films, or there might be kind of rare encounters that you've had with somebody that is obese and they tend to act in a way that makes them appear to be lazy. So that's a cognition there, that this laziness doesn't have any kind of evaluative nature ascribed to it. So in the context of the stereotype, there's nothing necessarily positive or negative about the laziness. The prejudicial element is the fact that you then have some sort of emotional response, so whether that's kind of distaste or disgust when you see somebody that is overweight. And then prejudicial discrimination will relate to this process of actually acting on this disgust. So for example, if you were interviewing somebody for a job and you have a candidate that comes in that's overweight, that they're obese, your decision to reject their application based on this prejudice or distaste that you have for overweight people, that would be an illustration of your discrimination. Okay, so what are the problems of us holding stereotypes or negative prejudices against other people? And for many of you ask, like, is it acceptable, is it okay to have a strong negative prejudice or stereotype against this outgroup? your intuitive response might be to turn around and go, no, Harry, it's not acceptable. We should try and avoid doing this. However, in most of your kind of lives or most of your experiences, you probably find yourself engaging in strong degrees of stereotyping, and there might be some very important groups that you hold a negative prejudice towards. And again, it might not necessarily be ones that you're willing to openly express and tell other people, but there certainly might be groups that you have a distrust of. So one example might be, if you imagine the kind of days before Grab Taxi, taxi drivers in Bangkok might be an example of a group that you think are continually out to get as much money as possible, that they often cheat by putting the meter on. And again, I'm not saying this is a stereotype that I necessarily hold, but it's one that you could imagine based on your past experience that you have, that you could form this stereotype or this prejudice, and easily then generalize to the idea that I think all taxi drivers are out to cheat me and are untrustworthy. And you can think back to these past experiences and then make a really kind of strong argument to yourself where you justify that, yeah, my stereotyping, my prejudice against them, it's valid. It's based on my experiences. So I think it's okay that I hold this prejudice. But there's a few good reasons why holding stereotypes and prejudices is problematic. The first one is that often a lot of the stereotypes that we have are typically negative, and this can ultimately lead to us engaging in discriminatory behaviours. It's also the case that there is a lot of variability in people's behaviours. So within a particular group, maybe if you think of the stereotype of what a Australian is like. So think of what are the characteristics of someone who's Australian. Is the case that they are into sports, they're maybe a little bit extroverted. I don't know. Think of what your stereotypical Australian would be. Now, within that entire population of Australians, there is a huge degree of variability. Yes, some are going to fall close to that central tendency or close to that stereotype that comes up in your mind, but there's going to be a lot that fall significantly away from this. And one of the problems with generating these stereotypes is obviously that we end up not evaluating people based on their individual personal traits and characteristics, but we evaluate them according to this sort of stereotype which clearly might not fit them. So one of the obstacles that this can present is that it makes it sometimes harder to get to know other people. So imagine, when you move to UQ, you've got a new bunch of students that you're all meeting for the first time, and you meet somebody who walks over that's wearing like a black leather jacket, they've got ripped jeans on, kind of stereotypical sort of punk rocker outfit that they're wearing. That for you might activate the stereotype that this person's a punk rocker. Maybe it's the fact that they're sort of introverted or eccentric. They're maybe a little bit moody. Whatever your stereotypical, maybe aggressive as well. Whatever your stereotype you hold of punk rockers would get activated. And then rather than trying to understand that individual and what it is that they are personally like, what it is that they're interested in, how do they treat you, we can disregard or ignore those attributes. And instead we focus on what are the attributes of our stereotypical punk rocker. So basically it can sometimes make it a little bit harder for us to know the true person that we're meeting. Now, our stereotypes are not always necessarily bad, and in many cases they can serve a really important function of just simplifying a very complex social environment and helping us to successfully navigate and predict and know what to expect in different situations. So in many ways, a lot of the stereotypes that you hold, they do not necessarily represent false or erroneous beliefs. a lot of the time a stereotype will capture relatively accurately the sort of prototype or the typical behaviour of a particular group that can reflect real group differences. So if you think of the stereotype that you might hold for Italians versus the stereotypes that you hold for Japanese people, if you were then told you've got an exchange student that's going to come and stay with you, and you're told they're Italian, then thinking of that stereotype that you hold for Italians, whatever characteristics you would attach to that, is probably going to give you a more accurate insight into how this person actually is, what are their interests, the sort of traits, the characteristics, etc., as opposed to the stereotype that you hold for the Japanese. So in some ways it can be useful for a prediction and helping to know what to expect. Similarly, if you've, I think one example that's taken from the text, if you've got two neighbours that move in next to you, one's a carpenter, one's a librarian, and you're sitting there one evening, you're kind of struggling to think of the name of a book that you wanted to read, you'd be much more likely to go over and ask the librarian, based on this stereotype that librarians are going to have a more extensive knowledge of books than the carpenter would. Now that's not to say it might be the case that this librarian doesn't really know that much about books. That would be unusual. It would be unstereotypical for a librarian not to know this. So most of the time these stereotypes, they do really serve a useful function. Okay, so what underpins or what leads to us experiencing or feeling prejudice towards a particular group? And in order to understand this, so we're going to talk about, there's several different factors that contribute to this. And I'm going to start by talking about one idea that was put forward by Gordon Allport. And to understand this, we need to first start with some very basic human tendencies. And the first of these is that we end up feeling hostility whenever we feel like we're frustrated, we feel like we're threatened, or when you witness something that is particularly unpleasant or unjust. So these things make us feel hostility. That's one basic human tendency. A second basic human tendency is the fact that when we're going around, we often like to categorize people as belonging to groups. So when we see an individual, we don't think of them necessarily as just as the individual. We categorize them as belonging to whatever the most salient social group is. So based on these kind of two tendencies, Allport proposed that basically if you end up witnessing or experiencing something that leads to hostility, and it's caused by an individual or a group of individuals, then we often link these hostile feelings to the social category or the social group that we think has caused these. So one example of how this might happen is if you look at what happened in response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks in America. So this is where there was terrorist attacks by a Muslim organization that caused massive atrocity in New York. But it's caused by a sort of relatively small, incredibly small proportion of Muslims. Yet the attitude from Americans towards both Arab Americans and Muslims more generally was very strongly negative post 9/11. So what you've got there is this huge overgeneralization based on the hostility that you're feeling towards this small minority, then gets much more broadly overgeneralized to everyone from that population. So similarly, in kind of more contemporary events, as the kind of coronavirus is spreading, this is something that particularly seems to be occurring in America, is that you get this much greater increase in both verbal and physical attacks on Asian Americans. And these negative feelings that have been associated with the virus are then becoming linked to the concept of China, or particularly Asia, because the first major outbreak ended up occurring there. And you've got this kind of being reinforced by Trump calling it the China virus. So then you've got this category of China being linked to these negative feelings, and it's very easy to understand how this prejudice, so this hostility towards Chinese individuals, might develop from this. So another way in which we can feel negative feelings towards an outgroup is if we feel like we're in competition with them for some sort of resource. So at one level, this can be competing for very tangible resources such as land, water, food. Most of the time, it's if we feel like we're in competition with them for resources such as jobs or status or housing, or access to adequate healthcare, etc. So one example that I always think of is in the United Kingdom, the right-wing media over the last decade or so has often portrayed immigrants to the country, and in most cases very unreasonably. They portray immigrants as competing very strongly for jobs, that they are taking up important resources in our healthcare service. They're taking up resources in our kind of social welfare and benefits service. And this perception, again, it doesn't need to be real competition. This perception that this outgroup is competing for the resources that you feel like is yours is enough to lead to hostility and negative feelings towards this outgroup. So that's another kind of strong contributor towards prejudice. Okay, one other way that we can experience prejudice or that can develop is through a natural tendency that we have to favour members of our own in-group. And one way this can particularly occur is through the preference that we have towards things that are familiar. We have this kind of natural in-group bias that we end up preferring families, friends, the cities, places, the groups with which we are most familiar. So around them we feel kind of comfortable, whereas with places and people that we feel less familiar with, we tend to feel more anxiety and sort of unease around them or around these places. And this is something that, certainly from a kind of group perspective, makes sense evolutionarily, that it would be adaptive to feel at ease and protected when you're around your in-group that's going to feed you, defend you from predators, etc. Whereas with strangers that you're not familiar with, it would make sense to feel a little bit uneasy with them, not necessarily trust them if you don't know how trustworthy they are. It's also the case that within these groups, we then tend to have a lot of self-serving biases where we inflate or overestimate the positive attributes of the group that we belong to, and basically believe that our group is fundamentally better than other outgroups. Now again, that's not always the case, but as a kind of general default, we typically have an overestimation of the values of the groups that you belong to. Now, a kind of crucial question in here is, if we're talking about the fact we've got these in-groups and out-groups, how do these actually form? How do you end up perceiving yourself as belonging to one group and other people as belonging to another group? How do we become a kind of us versus them? Okay, one of the first theories to try and understand and unpack this was social identity theory. And social identity theory made a very simple insight that when people are interacting with the world, they can do so either by thinking themselves as an individual or by thinking of themselves as a member of a group. And it turns out that our belief that we belong, so that we're a member to a particular group, it's not really that hard to come about. So we can believe that we belong to a particular group and that another group of people represent outgroup members on the basis of very sort of arbitrary differences, and in some cases sort of relatively meaningless distinctions between the group that you feel like you belong to and this outgroup. Now, to really illustrate people's preference for the in-group when they'd be assigned to it based on arbitrary reasons, some of the classic work in this domain is done by Tajfel under what is known as a minimal group paradigm. And we'll just pick one kind of classic study that illustrates this, was where they asked some high school students, so these were boys, to look at a series of abstract paintings that were painted by either the artist Kandinsky or the artist Klee. And they asked them to give some kind of description or write down what they thought about these different paintings. And then afterwards they would assign the students to one of two groups. So they would either say you belong to the Kandinsky group or you belong to the Klee group. Now the important thing is that they are being randomly assigned to these different groups, and they're also not being told who the other group members are. And then they would ask individual students to kind of play this hypothetical resource distribution game. So you would say you've got like 20 resources of something. This could be money, food, etc. And your job is to decide how do you want to divide that between your group, so say if you're one of the Kandinsky group, versus how do you want to divide that with the Klee group. And what you've got here is a situation where you've just been assigned to a group, you don't know who the other in-group members are, and what they're sort of expecting from this is that people would, knowing that it's kind of arbitrary, that they would be fair. They'd distribute half of these resources to your Kandinsky group, the other 50% to the Klee group. But that's not what happens. People tended to favour, so they would keep more resources for this very arbitrary a group that they've just been assigned to, and distribute less to the other group. So that's a real indicator that that we seem to, without needing many good reasons, we seem to form these bonds with a particular group quite easily, and then show some degree of favouritism towards that group. And then kind of building on this, one of the other big claims of social identity theory is that our membership of these groups maintains or serves the function of maintaining our self-esteem. So we derive a positive self-image from our membership with this group. So as such, we then end up really kind of going out of our way to emphasize the positives of the in-group and discriminating against the out-group that's there. So one of the ways I think you can see this at the most extreme level is if you look at football fans that have a kind of strong rivalry. So particularly in Europe, there's a lot of football groups that are very passionate about their own club, and this supporting of the club is a strong part of people's social identity. They think their club is the best, they think their supporters are the best, whereas they really kind of demonize the sort of rival clubs and the oppositions. So at least initially there was the idea that we increase our own sort of self-image and self-esteem by these two routes of emphasizing the positives of the in-group and then discriminating the out-groups. As the research kind of unfolded and more was studied on this, it turns out that maybe there's sort of less emphasis on the role of discriminating against out-groups here. And certainly it has a lot less of a role in terms of improving our self-esteem. So there are some studies that suggest discriminating against other people can have an effect on elevating our state level of self-esteem. So in other words, the very sort of temporary level of self-esteem that we feel. But it doesn't have an effect on traits, so like our long-term dispositional level of self-esteem. Now it's also notable that the particular group that we belong to, whether we even think of ourselves as belonging to a group or not, is determined by the current environment, so the context, whatever features are being made salient at the time. So there are times that we can think of ourselves as focused on our own kind of personal, singular identity, whereas there's other times that we think of ourselves as belonging to a particular group. And it's when we feel like we belong to a particular group that we often then feel like we share the identity, we share the values of that group that we belong to. So again, crucially what I'm saying, the particular group that we end up identifying is going to be based on the most salient features in the context. So to give you a very arbitrary example here of how group membership might be assigned to a set of spoons. So you've got 4 spoons here. One has a white handle, the other 3 don't. 2 of them are big, 2 of them are smaller teaspoons. So if we think about the spoon on the left hand side, this could be categorized as distinct because it has a white handle and the other 3 have metal handles. And in the social environment, that's much the same way that this woman here could see herself as being short compared to her colleagues that are all taller. There she might focus on herself and why she's distinct and different from the rest of the people. Whereas alternatively, you could categorize the spoon as also being a large spoon as opposed to the two smaller teaspoons. So this would be a kind of regular versus teaspoon size, and so too with females. You think of yourself as a female versus the comparison with males. So a little bit of a kind of abstract example, but in real life you can think of how the context can determine whether you view yourself as, say for example during the intergroup games when there's competitions between students from different faculties. What might become very salient here is your group membership as being a psychology student as opposed to being, say for example, a chemistry student. Whereas at other times, if you're maybe looking through the rankings of different universities in Thailand and you see that Chulalongkorn has scored above Thammasat, the group membership that then becomes salient is not down to the psychology or chemistry level. You focus on my group membership as a student at Chulalongkorn University. And a final factor that can cause prejudice is the particular cultural worldview that you end up growing up in. So if you're raised within a society or a culture that portrays a specific group very negatively, then being exposed to this kind of negative message towards the group the entire time is likely to mean that you end up sort of embedding or possessing this negative view that the society has towards a particular group of people. So you kind of internalize this prejudicial opinion. It's also the case that there are certain cultures or certain societies in which prejudice is deemed more or less acceptable. So for example, there's research showing that regions within America that deem prejudice to be kind of normative, then people that live within that society exhibit more prejudicial behavior. They exhibit more sort of anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant discrimination. And then finally, the worldview that we end up growing up with is going to really strongly determine what we believe and what we think is right and good. And then similarly, what things are wrong. And it might often be the case that we can't help but judge other people or hold other people accountable to these standards of what we think are good. And if they don't follow these particular behaviors or they don't do what we think is appropriate, then we judge them negatively on this basis and we have a prejudice against them. And that's a lot of the time simply because they've been raised in a different culture and that they have different values. And if we're sort of unable or unwilling to see that alternative ways of behaving, thinking can also be acceptable to other people, then yeah, we're going to experience or demonstrate prejudice towards outgroups on that basis. So there are some stereotypes that people possess which are clearly sort of blatant stereotypes that are extreme in their nature, that constitute sexism, racism, ableism, etc. But this generally accounts for a very small percentage, a small proportion of stereotypes. So an example would be, imagine that you meet someone who has a stereotype that women are less intelligent than men, and for this reason he thinks that in most top jobs, so if you're managing CEO, these positions should only be available to men. Women just wouldn't be able to do as good a job. Now these sort of stereotypes are really kind of wrong and damaging and are going to lead to discrimination. They also occur from a kind of controlled and conscious perspective that the person delivering and expressing the stereotype is absolutely explicitly aware that they possess the stereotype. For the most part, these sort of stereotypes are reducing based on exposure and education. So realizing that these are just unacceptable within modern day society. Now, obviously, there's cultural differences in the acceptability of these sorts of attitudes, and I'm sure within your society that there's certain elements of what we classify as blatant stereotypes that maybe do still proliferate. So these blatant stereotypes have this kind of clear and explicit flavour of racism and discrimination, but given that we've got these changes in social norms, so certainly over the last 50, 70 years, generally it's unacceptable to express these blatant stereotypes. And certainly if you were to say, definitely within Europe, if you said that a woman can't do a job as well as a man, this would be highly offensive. Even if it's something that you were joking about, it's not going to make you look particularly good. And there's numerous examples on social media of people making blatant stereotypes that lead to pretty significant consequences. However, this is not to say that stereotypes and racism has necessarily disappeared. They just happen to be much more subtle. And this added subtlety means that we often require the use of much more sophisticated measures to be able to detect either automatic, ambiguous, or ambivalent modern forms of stereotyping. So some of the kind of classic tasks that have been used for this are the sequential priming task, the weapons identification task, and the implicit association test. So one example of these, the sequential priming task, would involve subjects viewing. So we've got this illustrated here where you view a fixation cross, then you see a prime. In this case we've got a face that is going to appear either white or alternatively you could have a black face, and then you see a target word, and your job is to code that target word as does it belong to a pleasant or an unpleasant valence. What category should you represent that to? And if you want to identify implicit prejudice here, this will be revealed in your task performance, the reaction time it takes you to classify happy. So among white Americans that are doing this task, negative as opposed to positive words are going to be classified more quickly following the black faces as opposed to following white faces. So if you have an implicit negative stereotype or implicit negative bias towards black people, then that prime, the presentation of the black face, is going to cue, it's going to prime negative concepts. So it'll be spreading activation that activates negative modes, negative concepts, negative associations. And then when you see a target word that is negative, you're going to be much more rapid, much faster at categorizing that and coding it as an unpleasant category because you've been primed in that domain. Whereas for somebody that if you see that black face and it doesn't activate any negative associations, that's not going to speed up your response to a negative target word. Alternatively, there's another task, and it's the weapons identification task. So this is a variant that's used to assess implicit stereotypes. And in this one, similarly, we've got a fixation cross. Then you present either a black or a white face. So these are the primes presented for 200 milliseconds. And then they're followed by images that have some degree of kind of ambiguity, that it's not straightforward to work out what they are, and they're presented very briefly. So again, for 200 milliseconds. And your job is just to encode. Do you think that the tool, the object that you're seeing, is it a gun or is it a tool? And if you've got somebody that has negative stereotype of black people that automatically associate them with guns and violence, then you end up seeing a much faster categorization of when the gun appears after the black person's face. They would be faster to encode this, reflecting the stereotype of black Americans as being dangerous. And then finally, we also have the implicit association test. So in one version of this, in looking at a kind of race-based IAT, you're going to be presented stimuli that will either be white or black faces and positive or negative words. And then your job is to categorize using one key, the white faces and the positive words, or the black faces and the negative words using another key. So those would be during compatible trials, and then incompatible trials you would have to respond to white faces and negative words, and then black faces and positive words. And again, you can then look at whether people have a tendency to respond more quickly on this first set of compatible as opposed to the incompatible trials. Now, when we think of many of the stereotypes that we hold, it's very easy to think of a sort of stereotype that I have for one group is overwhelmingly negative, and the stereotype that I have for another group is overwhelmingly positive. So it's very easy to think that the types of stereotypes that we possess fall along this continuum of either being good or bad. But it turns out that for many groups, the stereotypes we can hold can be ambivalent, so they can combine a mixture of both sort of positive and negative valence attitudes. So for example, we might appraise or have a stereotype of Jewish people as being industrious, so that would be a kind of positive hallmark that they're willing to work hard, whilst at the same time thinking that they are ruthless. So in other words, that they're relatively kind of cold and harsh, which would be a negative stereotype. So the stereotypes that we hold are neither sort of univalent or unidimensional. So it's generally not the case that we simply love all of our in-groups, so we have purely positive stereotypes, and it's not the case that we consequently hate out-groups, that we have purely negative stereotypes towards them. It's much more subtle in the terms that we can have these kind of ambivalent mixture of positive and negative stereotypes that combine together. And one of the reasons that we develop these mixed or ambivalent stereotypes is because we generally base these stereotypes on two orthogonal or independent dimensions reflecting warmth and competence. So again, you should remember these from the stereotype content model.